Thank you very much, Jill, for inviting me to speak today. It's really lovely to see so many old familiar faces and also to welcome new faces to the group. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a clinical research fellow and neurologist at the Dementia Research Centre. Diego's a colleague, another neurologist, and he's really sorry to not be here today. He's in bed with flu, and he's sent me his slides, so I'll do my best to present his work for him. So a couple of years ago, Diego and I were invited to hold a discussion group at one of these meetings, really about neurological symptoms, some of the more unusual symptoms as well that people with PCA may experience. I don't know if anyone here was part of that discussion. I think I recognise a few people. I hope you found it helpful. We certainly found it extremely useful to be able to have a discussion like that where people share their experiences. And a few of the things we spoke about then have directly informed some of the research we're doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So I think really having this discussion arose because of one common question that comes up again and again, and I'm sure that you've often found yourselves asking it to yourself, which is this due to the PCA? That really difficult decision when a new symptom arises of knowing whether it can all be put down to the illness or if there's something else going on. So what I'd like to begin by talking about is what I would suggest as an approach when that situation arises. And that's really about safety, making sure that there's nothing else that could be going on that requires a different type of treatment. And PCA is relatively rare, so it's important to remember that your GP may have never seen anybody else with the condition. So when you ask them, could I expect to see this in PCA, they may not always be able to answer that. And that's why I think it's useful for you to be aware of some of the things that could arise. I want to emphasise that these are by no means things that will definitely happen. Not everybody will have these symptoms at all, but I do think that it's useful to have the knowledge and the awareness of what to look out for. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the symptoms and signs that can occur. I use the term symptoms to describe things that somebody with PCA notices and reports themselves, whereas signs refer to things that a doctor may pick up on examination that the individual with the illness may not have noticed themselves. And sometimes I'll use the term features just to cover both of them. So often what we're able to do is to say, yes, we do often see this in PCA. Unfortunately, we're not often able to say why that happens. And that's why I feel very strongly that we do need more research in this area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that is going on into these unanswered questions. Sorry about my cold. So if a new symptom develops, I think if there's anything that's of concern to you, the safest thing is always to go first to your GP and get it checked out. It obviously depends on the symptom itself. So sometimes your GP will be able to confidently say, yes, this is very, very much to be expected. There's nothing else that needs to be done to investigate it. But often symptoms can be vague and hard to pin down, and so they may sometimes want to do some tests. And some of the things they'll be looking at, which is useful also for you to be thinking in mind, could this be going on? Is there any sign of infection? Could there be, for example, a urinary tract infection on board? These can manifest in very subtle and vague ways, and it's an easy thing to pick up and treat. Sometimes your GP might want to do blood tests, and this is often looking for other treatable things. Is there an overactive or an underactive thyroid? Is there anemia? Is there a vitamin D deficiency? Vitamin D deficiency is really common in this country because of our horrible lack of sunlight. So there's and it can cause all sorts of vague aches and pains. So it's another thing that's easy to pick up, easy to treat. Think about whether there have been any new medications. Medication side effects are notorious for causing symptoms, and even if somebody's been on a medication for a while, it can sometimes be worth just reviewing what all those medications are. Are they really all necessary, and trying omitting one? Think if there's been any recent head injury. So if there's a real change in someone's symptoms and they've possibly had a recent fall, sometimes your doctor might want to arrange a brain scan just to make sure there's not been any bleeding. And that's quite unusual, but it's just worth thinking back. Has anything happened that has coincided with the onset of these symptoms? And think about the possibility of depression. Depression's really common in all forms of dementia, and it can be associated with lots of physical symptoms as well as mood symptoms. So loss of appetite, loss of weight, difficulty sleeping, fatigue. It's important to keep it in mind because, again, it's easily treatable with antidepressants, and it can make a real difference to both the physical symptoms and the mood side of things. And if somebody's depression is treated, they often then become much more able to cope with their other symptoms of PCA. So what symptoms does PCA cause? Well, as everyone here knows more than anyone, the main symptoms relate to vision, and that's because the areas of the brain that are most vulnerable are those involved in visuospatial and visioperceptual function. But there are also obviously a range of other cognitive skills that can be affected: spelling, calculation, and later in the illness, speech and even memory can be affected. And mood symptoms, I've said, they're very common, as well as depression, anxiety and agitation. PCA, unlike other forms of depression, tends to be associated with very, very much preserved insight into the condition. So I think in other types of dementia, that's not always the case, and it's possibly because people with PCA are so aware of the difficulties they have that we maybe see anxiety and depression a little more commonly. And so if we forget for the moment any philosophical debate about the difference between the mind and the brain, then those are all obviously neurological symptoms. They're coming from the same place. But what I'm really going to focus on today is more sort of hard neurological symptoms, things that aren't cognitive, aren't mood, but are other things to do with the brain. So headaches, dizziness, stiffness or slowing down of movements, difficulty controlling the limbs or difficulty using them, abnormal limb movements like jerks, and abnormal perceptions and hallucinations. And I say abnormal perceptions to refer to what happens when there's an object there and somebody with PCA sees it but just misperceives what it is. So, for example, a coat hanging on a rack may be misperceived as a person, whereas a visual hallucination is where a person is seen and there's nothing there that could be misinterpreted. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about motor features in PCA. So this is symptoms to do with movement, and I think it's useful to try and explain a little bit of the medical terminology and jargon, because these words make their way into doctors' letters that you might see, or carers might find them when they're doing research. So it can be useful to know what people are talking about. So apraxia is very common. This is difficulty using the hands to make gestures, for example, waving, or to manipulate objects. Myoclonus is also relatively common. This describes very subtle, often involuntary jerking movements, often of the hands or just the fingers. Myoclonic jerks are actually a normal thing that we all sometimes get when we're falling asleep. You know, when you're just drifting off to sleep and suddenly your whole body jerks, and that's a normal feature. But in PCA, that can happen during the day at any time, and often affecting the hands in particular. It's useful to know that it's part of the disease, I think, because otherwise sometimes it can be quite worrying when you first notice it. In most people, it doesn't cause any problems at all, and people just live with it. But in some cases, it can be quite prominent. So if these jerks are really interfering with what somebody's doing or causing them a lot of distress, there are medications that can be tried. And these are the kind of medications that are also used for seizures. So they're anti-epileptics. They dampen down abnormal brain activity. And it's worth noting that seizures themselves can actually occur in the later stages of the illness. So if they happen, it's definitely worth talking to a doctor, because they may benefit from medication. Some people develop Parkinsonism, and this term refers to a triad of symptoms: stiffness of the limbs, slowing of the movements, and tremor. It's similar to the signs that are seen in Parkinson's disease, but it has a completely different cause. And in PCA, as opposed to Parkinson's, sometimes you don't get all three of those features. So they may just have one limb that's quite stiff, they may just have become a little bit slow in their movements, or they may have a tremor. Sometimes a neurologist may want to try a medication that's more typically used for Parkinson's disease if that stiffness or slowing is very prominent. Unfortunately, they don't tend to be very effective in PCA, but I think sometimes it's worth trying just in case. And a rare and more unusual symptom that people sometimes develop is called alien limb phenomenon. And this describes what happens when one of the limbs just seems to move of its own accord. So without its owner being aware that it's doing it, it may lift up. It may even interfere with what the other arm is doing. And that we think it's pretty rare, but with all these symptoms, until you ask about them, you don't know about them. And that's why we're dependent on you for telling us what's important and what to look out for. So probably not unsurprisingly, the most common abnormal perceptions and hallucinations relate to vision. So it's very common to misperceive things in the visual world, because obviously your brain's having such a hard job putting together all the information it has to deal with. Some people also get what we call positive visual phenomenon. So that's actually seeing things when there's nothing there. So they may see movement when something's actually static. And they sometimes get what we call prolonged colour after images. Now, colour after images are again a normal phenomenon. If you look for a long time at something of one colour, and say something that's very bright red, and then you look at a white wall, you'll briefly see green, which is the complementary colour, and that's completely normal, and it's very brief and transient. In PCA, that sometimes happens as a much more prolonged effect. Seb wrote up a case of somebody who would find that after smoothing down red bed sheets, she'd look at her hands and they were bright green. And obviously this is quite frightening if you don't know why it's happening. But we do recognise that does happen in some people, and we really have no idea how common this is at the moment. More rarely, people have reported other abnormal perceptions. So sometimes people have said they smell things when there's nothing really there to smell, or things smell different, or they feel the sensation of touch when nothing's touching them, or just normal touch feels painful or uncomfortable. Again, these are things that just haven't been studied yet, but we'd really like to look into them, and we suspect that some of these things may be more common than we realise. Some people do actually develop very formed, very clear-cut visual hallucinations. They tend to be of people or of animals, and some studies have estimated that these occur in up to 25% of people with PCA, and that sometimes they're associated with Parkinsonism, stiffness and slowness of the movements, and what's called REM sleep disorder. So REM refers to rapid eye movement sleep. It's the stage of sleep when you're really deeply asleep. And what happens in this sleep disorder is that during that stage, people start almost looking like they're acting out dreams, wild flailing movements of the limbs, or even start trying to get up. So it's something they wouldn't be aware of themselves, but their partner in bed would notice because they kept getting bashed. And it's the kind of thing you might not think to mention, but it is worth mentioning because they can have associations. So one of the questions is, do these different symptoms give us clues to what might be going on at a pathological level in the brain? So as a lot of you probably know, from the studies that have been done, we recognise that the majority of cases of PCA are due to underlying Alzheimer's disease. So the changes in the brain are what we call amyloid plaques and tangles, as are shown there on the right. However, studies that have followed people with PCA up until post-mortem and have then looked at the brain have found that actually not all cases are due to Alzheimer's. More rarely, other pathologies can exist, and this just describes what's actually seen under the microscope. So another cause is something called dementia with Lewy bodies, or DLB, and this is different because the protein that's deposited in the brain is different. And sorry, I don't have a pointer, but you can see the middle slide, those little dark blobs there, they're called Lewy bodies. They're composed of a protein called alpha-synuclein, which is different to the amyloid protein that you find in Alzheimer's. It gets even more complicated because the two sometimes coexist. You can have both Alzheimer's and Lewy body pathology in the brain. But the studies that have been done have suggested an association between visual hallucinations and Parkinsonism with this Lewy body pathology. Another change that can be seen under the microscope is called corticobasal degeneration on the bottom slide, and again a completely different appearance under the microscope, although it may seem very similar in life. And it used to be thought that CBD, corticobasal degeneration, was associated with this alien limb feature and with stiffness of just one arm. But the more research people did, the more the plot thickened, the more complicated it got, because it then seemed that actually a lot of people who have CBD changes under the microscope didn't actually have those changes in life, whereas a lot of people who have those symptoms in life actually have Alzheimer's disease. So essentially, we've still got a lot we need to learn, and I think this just is one example of why brain donation is such a valuable contribution to research. So both Diego Kasky and I are very interested in doing research into neurological symptoms in PCA. And why do we want to do this? Well, firstly, it's so that we can give you a better explanation of why certain symptoms develop, so that we can understand these symptoms, and ultimately so that it can help us on the path towards developing new treatments. The ultimate goal for everyone is obviously to get treatments for PCA that actually stop the disease. Ideally, prevent it happening in the first place, but at the very least, slow it down or stop it spreading spreading through the brain. Increasingly, the treatments that are being developed are actually targeting the abnormal protein, so targeting the underlying disease process. So if you can imagine, if there are a number of possible different abnormal underlying proteins, if the symptoms can give you a guide as to which one might be going wrong, then in the long term we might be able to get treatments that are better targeted to people based on the symptoms they have. So, and what are we trying to answer? Well, in the first case, we're trying to understand the symptoms that a patient is experiencing so that we can get closer to an answer for them. Then we're trying to look at why they happen, which are the parts of the brain that are responsible. And in the process, we often hope that this can tell us something about how the brain works, both in health and disease. So at the last time, the last discussion group we had, what I was struck by was how many people said that they had noticed a problem with one of their arms. So an arm being stiff or an arm not doing what it was supposed to. Some people said it's like that arm doesn't belong to them anymore. They don't seem to be able to control it. They don't even seem to realise it's there. And I felt that just in that discussion, that seemed more common than we'd maybe previously appreciated. And so that spurred us on to do a study that we'd been thinking of for a while anyway, of looking back at all the patients we'd seen here at UCL who'd consented to take part in research and had a good quality MRI scan. We also looked at a group of 30 healthy controls who were mainly their partners and spouses who'd kindly volunteered to have a scan as well. And looking at the whole group, we found that actually a third of them had stiffness or difficulty using the left arm. So we then looked at that group separately, got all their MRI scans together and compared them to the MRI scans of people without those symptoms. This was work that Tim Shakespeare did using a very clever computer software program called cortical thickness, which allows you to measure the actual average thickness of different brain areas. And this is just very preliminary results. We haven't published it yet, but I thought you might be interested to see. First of all, just here on this side, this is the image of all the patients with PCA who don't have any problems with limb stiffness and comparing them to normal healthy controls of the same age. So the grey bit is just a sort of normal brain mask that the results are projected onto. The bright yellow shows the areas of the brain that are much thinner in patients than in healthy people. The red bit is a little bit thinner, but not so much. And as you can see, this is the front of the brain over here, that's the back there, and then it's a mirror image down the other side. And as you would expect, the areas that are very thinner, right at the back of the brain, that's where the term posterior cortical atrophy comes from, and that's why it's those functions to do with visual processing that the back of the brain serves that we see are affected. And what's interesting is that it's very symmetrical, and that's completely different from the situation we see in the other group. So that's the group with the left arm stiffness compared to healthy controls. If you remember, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. That's right over there. You see there's much more thinning on the right side of the brain, and it actually involves areas called motor cortex that are to do with the control of movement. So it's possibly a first step to understanding why some people develop these asymmetrical problems with their limbs. Obviously, the next question is what makes those individuals more vulnerable to getting pathology on that side of the brain, and that's really our next bit of work. So this is where I was going to hand over to Diego, and so I'll do my best to be Diego for the rest of the talk. Diego Kasky is a colleague that a few of you have met. He's a fellow neurologist, but he specialises in neurootology, and that's a very specialised branch of neurology that deals with problems of balance and dizziness. So I first started working with Diego on PCA because I had seen a number of patients who'd had really quite debilitating symptoms of intermittent dizziness, often with very bad headaches. We wanted to get the opinion of him and his colleagues as to what might be causing this. And actually, in a couple of cases, they felt it was a very atypical form of migraine, and they did respond very well to migraine treatment. So that was really great in terms of being able to treat the symptoms and improve things for the individual. But it also opened up some discussions about what might happen in PCA to make people more vulnerable to these symptoms, and whether PCA actually might have an effect on our perception of movement. So one of the most amazing things about the brain, this is from Diego, so he's biased, is that it has the ability to distinguish movement of the self from movement of the world around it. So both self-motion and environmental motion result in movement of images at the back of the eye. And if you think that should be more simple, just imagine for a moment that you're sitting on a train, the train's in a station just waiting to depart, and you look out of the window and see the train beside you pulling out. Most people will feel for a moment that it's actually them that's moving before realizing it's actually the other train. One of the ways in which the brain disentangles this information about motion is through information that comes from balance organs in the inner ear. These contain cells that are very sensitive to just the slightest change in head movement. They send signals to the brain which are then processed, so the brain can move from thinking, am I moving, to which direction am I going in? We just wonder whether in PCA these areas of the brain that process that information, and in particular put it together with visual signals, may be affected. So how can we look into this? Well, this is the kind of research that Diego does in his lab, and I'd like me to thank, I think a number of people in this room may have already helped with his research, for which she's very grateful. So participants are sat in a chair, a revolving chair that's within a curtain, and they're then moved around on the chair very slowly under different conditions. So the first experiment is in the dark, so all the lights are turned out, and the operator then starts the chair slowly revolving, and all the participant has to do is press a buzzer either on the right or the left to say, okay, I've started moving. The next experiment, and the lights are actually brought on, so it's still quite dim, but they can see the curtain around them, which has stripes on it. And they're kept still, but then the curtain gradually starts to rotate. And again, they just press right or left to say, I can see the curtain moving. It's either going in the right or it's going in the left. And then the third set of experiments is really a combination of the two. So the lights are on, they can see the curtain. The curtain's not moving, but they start to gradually rotate, and they have to say again when they feel themselves moving. In another set of experiments, he's been looking at spatial orientation, and we know that this knowing where you are in space and where other things are in space is one of the things that can be particularly difficult in PCA. So again, the subject is sitting on a revolving chair, the lights are on, and they're allowed to move themselves around so that they can see what's in their environment. There's a few big landmarks, so there's a plant over there, a chair over there, and they get used to where things are. And they're then moved in the dark, and they have to respond to say what they think they're in front of. So here it would be the plant. And this is very preliminary, but some preliminary results that he's got is that he's found that actually PCA patients are almost as good at controls at telling when they start to move. That's fine. So that's the condition that's in the dark. They're also really pretty good at telling when the curtain's moving. But what they have real difficulty with is distinguishing what's going on when they can see the curtain and they're moving. So they're the ones who are moving, but obviously when you move, you see the world actually moves by you, and that's the difficulty that they have. So it seems that if the brain receives coherent signals from all sensory systems, it can put them together correctly to work out I am moving or it is moving. In PCA, the brain has sent the correct signals, but it can't quite put together that information as well. And so that really brings me to the end. Diego's still sort of doing ongoing work in this area, so if anyone would like to volunteer to sit in his rotating chair, then do feel free to get in touch. I'd like to thank everyone who's already participated in this and on all of the research, and Seb, Tim and Keir, and thank you for your attention.